was an op-ed in the New York Times, and I don't typically talk about op-eds, but there were several data points in it regarding the US housing market and why it is that housing prices have increased by a whopping 24% over the last year, essentially pricing most American workers out of the market. What's at play here, and what can we do to mitigate these insane housing prices? Well, Ollie Wolf is the individual who wrote this essay for the New York Times, and he writes that historically, but even more so during the pandemic, those with higher income jobs, the most likely to work from home, McKinsey and Company found. As a result, many of them have chosen to move from more expensive areas of the country to lower cost metros, right? So there's been this, I guess, migration from major cities that are typically far more expensive to own a home in to suburban areas or maybe smaller metro areas where housing prices are certainly lower, but they typically reflect the income of the residents that already live there. And so when you have higher earners moving to these areas, what it does is it increases the value of homes, and there's a limited supply, a limited inventory of homes. And so they come in, they snatch up these homes, and they essentially price the current residents out of that market, right? So it's been pretty disastrous. And I was curious, like, is there a bubble at play? Is there a possibility that the market collapses, right? Is there some shady business going on? The same shady business that we experienced in the lead up to the 2008 housing collapse. And based on what Ollie Wolf is writing, no, that is not at play.
Well, maybe not a particular sort of shady business that you might be expecting.
Right.
There can still be other shady business going on.
There could.
But what did you find?
Okay, so this is what Ollie Wolf writes. He says, home buyers today are financially sound, with 73% of mortgages in the first quarter of this year going to those with a credit score of at least 760, up from 64% last year. Beyond good credit scores, and this is the important part, who cares about credit scores? This is really important. Buyers today have a healthy debt to income ratio and wealth thanks to some combination of savings, home equity, investments, and generational transfer.
So you're saying it's not the shady business that led to, 13 years ago, the housing bubble.
Exactly, because what happened 13 years ago was these lenders essentially giving mortgages to anyone and everyone without even doing, there was fraudulent paperwork. They of course didn't do the necessary investigations into people's financials to see if they could actually afford the homes that they were buying.
Or the system was set up where they could personally benefit, or the institutions they work for could still benefit, even giving it to people expecting that many of them would fail.
There was an incentive to give out as many loans as possible. And then the second half of that, of course, was I'm blanking on it.
You're talking about the financial collapse?
No. So they packaged these toxic mortgages up into securities, and then they did this whole process called credit default swaps. Essentially, the very corporations or banks that gave out these mortgages then bet against those mortgages in the stock market. So that was the second half of what led to that economic collapse. So it doesn't appear that behavior is taking place today, right? Is there something else at play that could be leading to a housing bubble? Honestly, at this point, I'm uncertain of that.
Not the mass buying up by large corporations or people outside of the US or anything like that, helping to reduce the supply?
That's the only thing, right? Because you have private equity firms borrowing money at incredibly cheap rates to purchase up residential real estate and then turn them into rentals. Now the question is, are they over leveraged? How much debt do they have? All it really takes is a shock to the economic system where Americans are unable to, let's say, pay their rent, and then it ends up being a really bad investment for the private equity firms. And so that's a possibility for sure.
And look, like I was alluding to earlier, there are different definitions of the term shady. So if companies are coming in and using their massive resources, which partially might have been achieved thanks to government deregulation or getting money for cheap that they can then invest in these businesses, and they buy up a ton, that may not be breaking any laws.
Right.
Or it might not even be setting up people for their own personal financial failure. failure, but it could still screw over people who want to buy a house.
Yes.
Like if Jeff Bezos decided, I'm going into Atlanta and I'm buying every single house, that's not breaking any laws necessarily, but it's still screwing people over.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that is what's happening. And really the only solution I can think of at this point, well, there's many solutions I can think of, but the most realistic solution is to construct more housing, of course. But the problem is you can construct more housing, but what's going to stop private equity firms from buying up those new developments? What's gonna stop foreign money launderers from laundering their money in US real estate, which continues to happen till this day? They buy up the real estate in cash in that case, right? So there's no issue there with over leverage or anything like that. They're just looking to launder their money, and the United States allows it to happen. So there are a lot of issues at play, but I do want to show you just how much housing has increased in price. So let's take a look at the first graph. It shows a growing gap in who gets mortgages. And so those with low credit scores are, I mean, they've got no shot, right? You can see that the amount of mortgages going to people with low credit scores has shot down significantly. Those with high credit scores, that has shot up, which is not a bad thing, right? You want to ensure that you're giving mortgages to people who can actually afford the mortgages, because we still have mortgage-backed securities in the stock market that pensions and retirement accounts are invested in. So if people are unable to pay their mortgages and they're foreclosed on, which would be awful, and that would completely ruin their financial health. The second half of that is all of these retirement accounts that are invested in mortgage-backed securities that might be toxic are gonna lose a significant portion of their retirement savings, right? And again, that was part of what happened in 2008. Let's go to the next graphic, because it shows you some of these smaller cities where wealthier people are now moving to, high income earners are moving to. Salisbury, Maryland, look at that. I mean, look at that graph. Boise, Idaho, you see the same trend.
What's up, Boise?
Yeah.
It's just awesome all of a sudden.
It's just cheaper to live there, right?
But the crazy thing about Austin is that, like, I lived in Austin years and years ago. It wasn't considered super cheap then or in the intervening years. And then, in the course of 1 year, it shoots up. That's a couple $100,000 per house right there.
It's nuts.
Which is why, like, you're right. It makes sense that people with lower credit scores are less likely to get the mortgages, even though there's a lot to be criticized about the credit scoring system, how people get trapped in low credit, but all that. But also, if you saw in that chart, there was the period leading up to the financial collapse where they were getting more, which arguably was a bad idea because they were being given them by shady financial operators. But you saw a little bit of before that period, and it was still higher than it is now, partially because houses in general weren't as expensive back then. So you didn't necessarily need to have pristine credit to be able to afford a mortgage. They were more comparable in some areas to rentals perhaps, whereas now, you can't even go to Boise or Salisbury without having incredibly overpriced real estate. So at that point, yeah, you have to have incredibly good credit, incredibly significant financial means to be able to pay for it.
And significant down payment, right?
Yeah.
You're not gonna get away with a smaller than 20%. FHA loans, for instance, would require a smaller percentage for the down payment, but you're now competing with high income earners, right? The people who are working remotely and are relocating to cheaper areas because they don't want to spend so much money on their houses. Like, for instance, a lot of people from Los Angeles are moving to Phoenix because the cost of buying a home is literally 50% less. For now, but I'm sure that you're gonna see the same trend in Phoenix very soon. And so the final thing I wanna add is, I gave you a few possible solutions. But there are models that work in other countries, and a good friend of mine, Tom Hank, who used to work here, drew my attention to what they're doing in European countries, places like Austria, for instance, where they have something known as social housing. And it's incredible. It really is incredible because they invest appropriately in government subsidized housing. And so people aren't spending the majority of their income on a place to live. And the important thing is, it's different from what you see with public housing in the United States. they actually have really, really nice publicly subsidized housing there. I mean, it looks like luxury hotels or luxury apartments.
But then how are they supposed to know that they're terrible, terrible people, failures? That should always be that way.
It is fascinating that they don't punish people for not being wealthy.
They must have some other way that they do it.
In European countries. But definitely, I'm gonna do a deep dive on social housing on this show, and probably also for the show I host on Jacobin called Weekends. So subscribe to that channel if you haven't already. It's a show I do with Nando Vila every Saturday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.